In the luxurious restaurant, where the whispers of conversation merged with the melody of exquisite music, the atmosphere seemed perfect, but beneath the glittering surface, darkness and prejudice lurked. The main hall was filled with elegant guests eager to enjoy the exquisite dishes created by the unrivaled chef. That evening, as the Michelin stars peered down from the sky, a black woman walked through the door. Confident and elegant, the guests' eyes turned to her, some with admiration, others with open displeasure. She passed the elegant tables, but one of the staff, a young waiter with a cold gaze, stopped her, crossing his arms. "Sorry, but we don't serve you," he said with disdain, as if she had no right to be there. The woman, startled, looked at him for a moment, as if searching his eyes for a spark of understanding. At that moment, the heart of the room sank. She knew that here she was not just a guest, she was a chef, the creator of culinary masterpieces that even the most demanding critics spoke about. How could this be? What courage does a person have to disregard her talent and personality just because of the color of her skin? We invite you to join this story. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Each of you is very important to us, and your support helps promote our channel. Let's work together to make each of your voices heard. We appreciate your support more than you can imagine. The air was filled with the light smell of freshly prepared food, mixed with subtle notes of perfume and expensive whiskey. The elite restaurant La Blanche was located in the very center of the city. Its elegant interior attracted the eye, from the marble floors to the golden chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings. Every night the most demanding guests gathered here, famous businessmen, actors and critics. They came not only for the culinary masterpieces, but also to show their superiority over the world that surrounded them. The waiters' smiles, like masks, hid their prejudice and arrogance. Each of them knew that their job was not only to serve food, but also to maintain a certain image of the establishment, an ideal atmosphere in which only the chosen ones could feel comfortable. On the walls hung paintings by famous artists, and on the tables there were snow-white tablecloths, from which it was impossible to take your eyes off. That evening, when the most influential people of the city had gathered in the restaurant, the door opened and a woman entered the room. Her dark skin sparkled in the light of the chandeliers, and every movement was filled with grace and confidence. She was dressed in an elegant but modest dress that emphasized her figure. The guests turned around, and for a moment there was silence in the room, as if everyone was frozen in anticipation. The waiters looked at each other, and some of them looked displeased. One of them, a young man with a stern face and cold eyes, clearly did not like this woman. He believed that people like her should not be in such places. The woman confidently walked towards the empty table, but his icy gaze stopped her halfway. Crossing his arms over his chest, he approached her with a defiant grin. "Sorry, but we don't serve you," he said emphatically, clearly considering it his right. His words were like a punch in the face. She froze, not believing her ears. How could a man in such a place refuse her, not even knowing who she was? Around her, the guests began to whisper, some curious, others displeased. She felt the gazes directed at her with curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps even sympathy. The waiter continued to look at her with arrogance, as if assessing how suitable she was for this world. "Or do you want me to call security?" he added, clearly enjoying his power in this situation. She took a deep breath, trying not to show her confusion and anger. How could this be? What right did this man have to judge her based on her skin color and appearance? Under the surface of the elegant establishment, tension was brewing, ready to flare. The woman knew that this was not just a rejection, this was humiliation, something she had experienced before. But this time, everything was different. She was not just a guest in a restaurant, she was a chef, the creator of dishes that delighted even the most demanding gourmets. And now, when her dignity was under threat, she decided that she would not allow herself to be humiliated. As the woman paused, disbelieving what was happening, a fire ignited inside her. She folded her arms across her chest and looked at the waiter, and despite the prejudice and coldness in his voice, determination sparkled in her eyes. In that moment, she was not just a black woman in a fine restaurant, she was a chef, respected and appreciated for her talent. By now, her thoughts had wandered to the kitchens where her staff worked, creating delicious dishes from fresh ingredients. She remembered how, day after day, working herself to the point of exhaustion, she had established herself in an industry where stereotypes and prejudices prevailed. Images came to mind, how she, young and full of hope, fought against prejudice, wanting only one thing: to be recognized for her skills, not the color of her skin. Meanwhile, the other guests continued to watch the conflict. Some whispered among themselves, pointing at her. Others giggled quietly, delighted to be able to watch a scene in which a person in a position of power humiliated someone they considered inferior. Every whisper, every smirk only increased her anger. The waiter's words, full of contempt, reflected all the stereotypes she had encountered throughout her career. "Are you serious? You don't know who you're talking to," she said, her voice quiet but full of power. The waiter narrowed his eyes, not understanding what she was hinting at. At that moment, her assistant emerged from the kitchen, peering nervously to see what was going on. He, like the others, had heard the commotion, and his eyes met hers, full of determination. "What happened?" he asked, ready to intervene, but she shook her head, making it clear that she wanted to handle the situation herself. The waiter, ignoring her words, continued to insist on his own. "Maybe you think that your appearance gives you the right to be here? You are not in the place to demand anything," he said, emphasizing each word. The woman felt her blood boil inside. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was a direct insult. She sighed, trying to remain calm, but a storm was brewing in her head. Behind her stood a kitchen full of anticipation and hard work. Each of her workers poured their soul into the dishes that pleased the guests, and she couldn't let humiliation ruin everything they had worked for. "I am the chef of this establishment," she said, each syllable escaping her lips with the determination of a hammer breaking glass. Suddenly the room went silent. The waiter froze, unable to believe his ears. The guest's eyes, previously full of condemnation, now widened in surprise. But there was still arrogance in his gaze. "That can't be right. I refuse to serve you. Take that mask away from here. It doesn't suit you," he said, hoping that his words would elicit laughter and support from the others. But she knew this moment was more than a clash of personalities. It was a battle for recognition and dignity. The woman raised her head, her voice even more confident. "Don't you dare judge me by my appearance. I created this place. I put my strength and passion into it, and I demand that you treat me with respect." Her words, filled with force and stubbornness, echoed off the walls of the restaurant. The tension in the air grew, and many of the guests began to realize that this was not just about her, but about how easily human dignity could be forgotten. The restaurant they were all in was a place where the real fight for respect and equality was just beginning. The chef's words fell like stones to the floor, causing a crackling and rustling sound among the silk tablecloths. The silence that hung over the room seemed oppressive, but she knew that this was her moment, the moment when everything had to change. The waiter, noticing the confusion of the guests, tried to maintain his arrogance, but his face still betrayed fear when he realized that he had run into a wall of inflexibility. "Listen, you're not here to demand respect," he said with contempt, his voice sharp as a knife blade. "People like you need to know their place." His words were full of cruelty, and they sounded like the bottom from which businessmen like him never rose. The other guests, still watching the unfolding scene, exchanged glances. Some looked away, not wanting to be part of this disgrace. Others, on the contrary, immersed themselves in the atmosphere. Their thirst for spectacle and scandal only fueled the tense atmosphere. She felt all eyes focused on her, and it was both terrifying and liberating. "You think your words can hurt me?" she said defiantly, her voice calm but threatening. She stepped closer, and now there was only a thin line between respect and hatred between them. "I haven't heard enough of the kind of nonsense you're whispering here in my 30s, baby," she added, showing that she wouldn't give in. She could remember hundreds of times she had to fight for recognition, for the right to be in this world where most people judged her by the color of her skin, not her talent. The waiter merely smirked in response, his face twisted in contempt. "Let's see how you behave after I tell everyone who you really are," he hissed. "No one was expecting you here, and they never would have." His words were like sharp knives, piercing the atmosphere of the room, fueling hatred as if it were the universe itself. Some of the guests began to laugh quietly, sneering at the humiliation they were witnessing as if it were entertainment. Every movement, every whisper echoed in her heart, making her want to resist this obscurantism. She knew that this waiter was just one of many who did not understand that every word was more than just a sound. It was an insult, a crime against human dignity. "You will never understand what it means to fight for your life," she said with hateful warmth, as if every syllable had been torn out in pain. Looking into his eyes, she saw something more than just arrogance. It was fear. Fear that his world might collapse. Fear that she could change their entire reality. In that moment, she realized her power wasn't just in her words, but in how she could change the perception of everyone in that room. Know that I am not just a chef. I am here to conquer this world and nothing will stop me, she said with confidence. But his answer was even more cruel. You may be able to cook, but you'll never be like us, he said, glaring at her. There were cheers and murmurs of support from those in the room who were glad that someone had finally put her in her place. As if to confirm his words, other waiters began to come closer, casting disapproving glances at her. She knew this was no longer just a conflict, it was a challenge, and she couldn't back down. You still haven't figured out that I won't let myself be humiliated, she said, her voice rising to reflect the hatred she felt for this arrogance. And as she turned to the room, she noticed that some of the guests began to nod approvingly, while others looked at her confidence with bewilderment. They could not understand that she, this black woman, had become a symbol of resistance, and in that moment, in this elegant but cruel world, her spirit and will became brighter than ever. Every word she uttered became a manifesto, and in that dark room full of arrogance, she suddenly felt that she had the opportunity to change everything. The silence in the room grew increasingly tense. The guests' eyes, which had previously watched the conflict with curiosity, were now clouded with confusion. They had witnessed the perfect world created around the high-class restaurant being torn apart, but that didn't stop the hatred brewing beneath the surface. The waiter, his fists clenched stubbornly, refused to give in. He looked at his colleagues, and a smirk played across his face. "Do you all see this?" he said, addressing the group. "This is a shining example of what happens when we allow people like her into our world." He pointed at her, his gesture full of contempt. At this point, there were whispers in the air, and some of the guests, grinning, joined in. "That's right, she's out of place here," someone said, and the others began to chime in, finding pleasure in the humiliation. The atmosphere around them was filled with a nesting hatred, as if all the prejudices hidden beneath the surface had come to the surface, causing laughter and approval. She felt the pain pierce her. The muffled jokes and taunts around her were like whiplash. "Why are you all so afraid of me?" she screamed, her voice rising above the noise, refusing to be drowned out. Her eyes were blazing with rage. She saw the waiter mimic her, adding a scornful tone to her words, as if she were nothing more than a toy for his amusement. "Afraid?" he asked with a haughty grin. "You're just a joke. You'll never be part of this world. You're just proof of what we all know, people like you can't cook or behave." Her anger reached its peak and she could no longer remain silent. "You don't even understand who I am," she said, her words sounding like a challenge. "Do you think that your derogatory attitude makes you stronger? You are a fool, blinded by your own prejudices." With each word she said, the hatred in the room only grew stronger. The waiters, like frightened sparrows, began to gather around, encouraging each other. Each of them seemed ready to support their brotherly hatred, finding in it some strange form of strength. "You know your career is over," one of them said, coming closer. He said it as if it were not a threat but a final sentence. The waiters laughed, their laughter full of malice, as if they owned the place and she was just a puppet in their show. The woman felt panic rising inside her. The words weren't just hurting her, they were tearing her dreams apart. She knew she had years of work behind her, but every laugh around her seemed to eat away at her confidence. Her face flushed with anger, and a spark of despair flickered in her eyes. She folded her arms across her chest and took a deep breath, gathering her strength. "You think this humiliation will stop me? You are wrong. I have no intention of leaving, and your words only strengthen my resolve. Each of you is an example of how fear can turn to hatred," she said, her voice like steel, reflecting the truth that was piercing the darkness. But this wasn't just a call to the waiter. This was a call to everyone who had ever felt humiliated, misunderstood, undervalued. She saw how some of the guests began to exchange glances, and their confidence began to crack. Perhaps they, too, hated what was happening here, but kept quiet so as not to become part of the conflict. The waiter, noticing the hesitation, was startled. He quickly changed tactics, trying to regain control. "You're just playing a role," he said, looking at her with disdain. "You'll never be able to overcome what we have, because you don't belong here. You have no rights here, and you know it." Her heart pounded with fear, but it also fueled her determination. Every verbal attack he made only confirmed that her fight for equality was not in vain. It ignited a desire to change perceptions, to show that beneath the color of her skin was a strength no one could ignore. "I'm not leaving here until I show you all what true strength is. You think you're above me, but I'll come back and tear your stereotypes to pieces," she said, and there was a new, previously unknown accent in her voice. It was anger, ready to turn into a powerful tornado. The other guests, who were beginning to show sympathy for her, looked at her with increasing caution. They felt the world around them changing, the hatred and prejudice they had taken for granted suddenly looking vile and wrong. It was at that moment, with all eyes on her, that the chef realized that even in a world filled with hatred, she had the power to change that reality. Every breath she took was a challenge. Every word was a sword that could pierce the walls of prejudice that had been built up over the years. The hatred, like a black cloud, continued to thicken, but she was ready to fight it, standing on her own 2 feet, no matter what. The silence in the room, which had once been filled with a friendly atmosphere, was now shattered into pieces. The hatred brewing among the guests was reflected in the eyes of many of them. A poisonous spirit of prejudice hung in the air, and the woman herself, standing before her opponent, became a symbol of resistance. "Do you really think you can change our minds? You don't belong here," the waiter said, a look of contempt on his face. He took a step forward as if he was going to rip her to pieces. The guests began to laugh, and the laughter became a collective embodiment of this hatred. "Look at her," one of the men in the audience shouted, pointing at her. "She can't even hold a knife properly. You think a black woman can create anything worthwhile? Please." His words, full of racist contempt, reflected the growing humiliation they were feeling. The hatred that filled the room seemed to have a life of its own. The waiters exchanged glances, and their faces showed approval, as if they supported this anti-morality. Each of them immersed themselves in humiliation with pleasure, as if it were an entertainment that allowed them to get rid of their own fear. "You don't even deserve this place," the other waiter said, a hint of menace in his voice. He came closer, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Nobody wants people like you working here. We, the real chefs, created this place." He took a step toward her, pointing a finger as if she were just a piece of meat to be butchered. She felt anger boiling inside her. "Are you all just going to give yourselves the right to decide who deserves this place and who doesn't?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You think your hatred makes you stronger? You are mistaken. You are the weak ones, and your stereotypes do not define me." But the words only added fuel to the fire. "Look at her. She can't even explain how she does her job," one guest shouted, and his words, full of disparagement, became a chorus that others joined in, creating a cacophony of disdain. There were screams in her head, but they couldn't stop her. She knew she had to stay strong. Her co-workers were nearby, but even they couldn't seem to stand up to the consensus. In that moment, she realized that this was her fight, her struggle, and no one could protect her. "You're just playing a role that doesn't suit you," the waiter said, looking at her with disdain. He was full of confidence, believing that her humiliation was what he needed to strengthen his position. "You're not fit for this place, and no one will respect you until you realize that you're just a joke." Her heart began to beat faster. The waiter's words, full of arrogance, seemed to hit her in the chest. At this moment, the tension in the room reached its limit. The guests who had previously been watching the conflict with interest began to laugh, as if they were amused. The hatred that had been building up for years burst out, and she became its target. "Look at her, she has no skills at all," said another guest, his laughter full of malice. "She can't even cook a simple dish. All these black chefs, if only they were allowed into such a place, it's a disgrace." These words, full of prejudice, echoed in the room, and in response to them, others began to shout, "Yes, that's right, she can't keep up the level." Her soul was filled with bitterness. She felt how the prejudice of the people around her only strengthened her will to fight. "I can do more than you will ever imagine," she said, her voice full of determination despite all the humiliation. "You think you can humiliate me and break my will? I will not let you do that." She took a step forward, and this step caused a wave of surprise among the guests. Her confidence was like a shield, reflecting the hatred that was flying in her direction. "You cannot break me, and you cannot define who I am. I am the chef of this place, and I will not leave it until I show you that your hatred is just a shadow that I can dispel." At that moment, Her words became a cry for help for anyone who had ever experienced bias. There were cheers all around, as if the other guests were beginning to understand that this was not just one woman's struggle, but a confrontation with an entire system of hatred that was trying to break them. But the hatred was relentless. The waiters began to huddle together, preparing to strike back. They saw her words as a threat to their status, their position in this elite world. One of them, breaking through the crowd, shouted, "You have no right to be here. We will not have the likes of you ruining our business." The woman felt her heart pounding. Her dreams, her efforts, everything she had built were now at risk. But in that moment, she realized, true strength does not come from being accepted, but from fighting for your truth, even when the world is against you. "I won't leave," she screamed in response to their hatred. Each of her cries was filled with determination. "I will stay here until I show you that true strength is not the one who screams the loudest, but the one who stands his ground despite all the hatred." The words struck the room like lightning, and in that moment she realized that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had ever suffered from bias. The hatred around her was palpable, but she couldn't let herself break. She had to stand. The excitement in the hall reached its peak. The guests' eyes, full of hatred and contempt, did not leave her. Every word she uttered awakened in them the desire to knock her down. They were ready to sink to the bottom, just to preserve their prejudices and remain in the safe zone of their arrogance. "You will never be a part of this world," the waiter said, interrupting her confident speech. His words were full of hatred, as if he was pumping himself full of anger to create the illusion of strength. "You are proof that this world is full of mistakes. You are an embarrassment not only to yourself, but to everyone around you. You are not just a black woman. You are a symbol of everything that should not be here." The crowd, like a flock of sheep, took up his words, and the hall erupted in cheers. "Yeah, you're not wanted here. We know who people like you are," someone shouted from the back rows, and this fueled their hatred. Every stupid comment, every disdainful word served only to confirm their own stereotypes. She felt the hatred that rained down on her from all sides becoming heavier and heavier, like an unbearable burden. Every laugh and cry insulted her, but she understood that her fight was only beginning. Her confidence was becoming her shield, and she could not allow these pathetic attempts to break her. "You think your words can hurt me?" she said, slowly looking around at everyone present. Her voice was filled with determination like never before. "You are all here, a reflection of your fears. You are afraid to see how I can become what you can never be. I am not just a chef. I am your worst nightmare." Her words made many of the guests freeze. Some of them began to realize that the derogatory words they had once uttered with pleasure reflected more on their own shortcomings than on her abilities. But the hatred was still strong. The waiter seemed in no mood to give in. "I know who you are," he hissed, his eyes blazing with rage. "You're a loser who wants to get in over her head. You're not going to change our minds just because you scream. You're just another mistake we won't tolerate." A searing hatred coursed through her, but instead of giving into it, she stepped forward. "You know, I'm not here to seek your approval," she said furiously, her voice growing even stronger. "I'm here to show you that your fear is based on your own weaknesses, not my abilities. You've all forgotten what it means to be human." The guests continued to laugh, as if it was the funniest joke they had ever heard. But there was more to her words than just a challenge. It was a cry for help for all those who had ever suffered humiliation. She knew she was not alone. Every step she took was aimed at breaking down the walls of hatred and prejudice. One of the waiters, having emerged from the crowd, decided to come closer to intimidate her even more. "Do you really think you can defeat us? We all know who you really are. You're just another mistake that's going to go down," he shouted, his face contorted with anger. "Mistake? Are you not mistaken in your assessment?" she said, her voice like lightning. "I am here because I have earned this place. And you are here because you have nothing else. You do not know what a real job is." But every answer she gave was met with a new wave of hatred. Guests who had previously sat in silence now began shouting racist insults at her from the depths of their minds. She should never have been here. "Look at her. She doesn't even know how to serve food properly." Every word was a blow to her dignity, and she felt the blows raining down like hail. They weren't just insults. They were attempts to break her spirit, to undermine her confidence. But it was at that moment, when the hatred reached its peak, that she realized she couldn't give in. She couldn't show weakness. "You are all just clowns playing games to hide your fears," she said, her voice filled with determination. You think your prejudices can break me? I see you for who you are, and I don't need your approval. I am not just a chef. I am someone who will not remain silent while you continue to destroy lives based on your vile stereotypes." As she gathered her strength, she felt the world around her begin to change. The hatred that had been lurking among those present suddenly collided with her determination, and her words became a weapon against prejudice. Her voice, reflecting her struggle and suffering, became a symbol of hope for those who had ever suffered from humiliation and prejudice. But the waiter, feeling threatened, tried to strengthen his position again. "You don't belong here. You're just proving that you shouldn't be here. You won't be part of our world until you realize that you're just a mistake." Her heart began to beat faster, but she knew this was her moment. "You think you can control this world? That your hatred can break my soul?" she said, her words ringing like thunder. "You don't understand that true strength doesn't come from putting others down, but from accepting people for who they are." With every word she spoke, the hatred around her began to dissipate, like clouds blocking the sun, and though she knew the fight was just beginning, in that moment she felt the support of those who might have been afraid to open up before. Her resolve burned brighter than ever, and she was ready to stand against all the hatred in the world. The room was filled with a hum of discontent and hostility. The faces of the guests, who had previously expressed only contempt, now became gloomy and ominous. Hatred, like a black cloud, enveloped the space, and the whispers of insults became louder. It was like a curse, raining down on her from all sides, creating an atmosphere filled with threats. "You don't consider yourself a part of our world, do you?" said one of the men standing in the front rows. His words were spoken with such contempt that they sounded like a sentence. "You are nothing but a disgrace on our faces. What the hell are you doing here? You have no right to stand on this stage." There was a rage in his voice that mirrored his fears. He couldn't accept that she, a black woman, could be in a place like this elite establishment. Looking at her, he saw only a threat to his existence, and his hatred only grew. "Yeah, you can't be a chef with that look," another guest echoed, his words dripping with racist undertones. "You're just another mistake that got involved in something that wasn't your business. You'll never understand what it's like to be part of a real culinary culture." These weren't just words. This was humiliation, designed to break her spirit. She felt this hatred piercing her, like sharp needles piercing her soul. Her confidence began to weaken under the onslaught of their words, but a spark of resistance ignited inside her. "You are all here but witnesses to your own stupidity," she said, clenching her fists to suppress the tremor in her voice. "Your hatred and prejudice are but a reflection of your own failures. I am here because I deserve this place." The guests began to whisper, their smiles disappeared, and real hatred was reflected on their faces. One of the men stood up and began to slowly move towards her. His eyes were burning with anger. "You understand that people like you will never be equal to us, right? You are just playing your stupid games, and no one is going to listen to you." His face reflected the true nature of the hatred, the fear, the misplaced anger, the darkness that filled his soul. He stepped closer, as if trying to intimidate her with his presence. "You're not just a black woman. You're a mistake. Understand that, and maybe you can leave with pride." The words, full of racism and arrogance, rained down, and she found it hard to breathe. She felt the anger building in her chest, and she knew she couldn't give in. "You want me to leave? To give in to your hatred? I won't let you do that," she said, her voice confident despite all the humiliation. "How dare you?" another guest shouted, his face contorted with rage. "You, a black woman, are going to resist? We are just laughing at you. You have no place among us." At that moment, her eyes met those of the waiter who had insulted her first. He seemed to enjoy the humiliation she was experiencing. His laughter was like devilish music, and she realized that this moment was a triumph for him. His hatred had exposed all the prejudices they had all been unaware of. "You don't need any proof to know that I'm not here to please you," she said, and her words were like a punch in the face of everyone present. "You're all just afraid that I'll outdo you, and that's why you're here, trying to humiliate me. Your stereotypes are your own shackles." One of the guests couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "Say that again. We all know you're just an ordinary chef and nothing more." There was such arrogance in his voice that she felt a storm brewing inside her. Each of them was a reflection of what she once feared to become. "Yes, and you are the one creating your reality based on these stupid stereotypes," she replied, her voice as menacing as a storm. "Don't you understand that your hatred is just your own fear? You are afraid that I can become what you can never achieve." The hatred in the room reached its peak. The guests began to throw glasses and plates off the tables, creating a noise as if they were starting a riot. Their anger was overflowing, and each of them felt that he had to express his contempt. "You have no right to be here. You are only here for entertainment," one of them shouted, and his words were like a cold shower, burning her. At that moment, one of the waiters, unable to contain his hatred, stepped forward and raised his hand as if to hit her. It was desperation, personifying all the fears and prejudices that had accumulated in this elite restaurant. She saw in his eyes that he was about to cross the line, and it reminded her how dangerous their prejudices could be. But instead of backing down, she stood up even stronger. "Hit me! You think you can break me? I'm not one to give in. You're just showing who you really are," she screamed, her voice echoing throughout the hall. Silence fell over the room for a moment. Everyone present stood frozen, looking at her. They were taken aback by her boldness. The hatred they had come with was beginning to wane, but it could not go away yet. The waiter stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. "You all just showed your true colors," she said, not taking her eyes off him. "Your hatred and contempt are just a mask for your own fears. I will fight for myself and for those who have ever suffered such humiliation. I will not leave until I show you that your time is up." Her words, full of confidence and strength, filled the room with tension. She was ready to stand against everything they could offer her. Every step she took was a step towards freedom from hatred, and she knew that this was only the beginning of her fight. The room was filled with an oppressive silence. She could hear her heart pounding in unison with the hoarse breathing of those present. The hatred in their eyes was like a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. The guests began to whisper, exchange glances, and it all seemed like anticipation of an approaching storm. "You still think you can talk to us like that?" one of the men growled, rising from his seat. He was large and powerful, his hard features embodying all the cruelty that had accumulated in this room. "You, black lady, will never be on our level. We are laughing at you, and you don't even realize it." His words cut through her like a knife, and in the eyes of the other guests she saw hatred begin to flare up like fire in dry grass. "Yes, we are here to show you that you do not deserve this place. You are just a black dot in our perfect picture," the woman next to him added, her voice like the hiss of a snake. She felt the anger building in her chest, and strangely enough, it only spurred her on. "You think that your hatred makes you stronger, that you can insult people just because they look different?" she said, her voice like a thunderclap. "Your hatred is your curse, not mine." "Oh, look at her, how she's screaming," laughed one of the women, adjusting her designer outfit. "She thinks she can argue with us. She doesn't know what real life is like. She's just part of the service." Their bloated dresses and high heels elevated them above her, but she could not and would not accept it. "You live in a bubble of your own superiority," she exclaimed, "and when it bursts, you will find yourself at the bottom, like all those who are proud of their hatred." Her words only fueled the guests' hatred. They began to laugh and insult her even louder. "She's just trying to attract attention. All this noise is just to look important." Another voice rang out. "Do you find it funny? Do you really find it funny to humiliate someone for the color of their skin?" she asked, her voice filled with sadness and anger. "Don't you understand that your words can kill? Don't you understand what it's like to be the object of your contempt? What does she know about pain?" The same man hissed, clenching his fists. "She only proves that people like her can only be down there. You shouldn't be here, and we'll show you." He moved forward as if he was going to hurt her, and her heart pounded with fear. "I will not run away from you," she cried, her voice echoing through the hall like thunder. "I will not be your victim. You will not break me with your hatred." At that moment, there was a sound of shattering glass from behind. One of the guests, completely out of control, threw a glass in her direction. The glass shattered like pellets, and the shards sparkled as they hit the floor. "Take her away. She's not worthy of us," he shouted, and the others, taking up his words, began to offer their own incitements. "Yes, take her away. This is no place for her," the other guests echoed, their eyes blazing with hatred. They began to rise from their seats as if preparing to attack, and she realized that their anger had gone beyond all bounds. Unable to bear this humiliation, she took a step back, her breathing becoming heavy. "Do you really not understand what your words can do? Do you think you can scare me?" she said, her voice becoming more determined. But instead of answering, they only laughed, a laugh of arrogance and disdain. "She's only playing her game. It's nothing more than a pitiful spectacle," one of the men chuckled. turning to his friends. At that moment, one of the guests, more aggressive than the others, grabbed her hand. His grip was hard, and she saw real hatred in his eyes, as if he was ready to break her. "You will not leave here without punishment." "Let her go!" shouted another, not to protect her, but to show his power. "If she does not want to leave this place, we will decide what to do with her." She knew she had to resist. Her soul was burning with rage. "You have no right to touch me," she screamed, jerking her hand away. "You only prove that you are cowards. You are trying to break what you cannot understand." This challenge only fueled their hatred. People began to crowd around, and the atmosphere became tense. They surrounded her from all sides, their cruel looks full of contempt. One of the guests, taking his cue from the waiter, began shouting racist insults, his words sounding like a death sentence. "You're just a freak of nature. You can never be part of us. Go back to your ghetto," he screamed, his voice cutting through her like a knife. "Don't you think you've overstepped your bounds?" she said, clenching her fists. "Don't you realize that your words and actions only make you look more ridiculous?" But instead of stopping, they only increased their onslaught. Shouts of hatred and humiliation came from all sides, and she felt her strength being exhausted under the pressure of their malice. It was like a wave washing over her, robbing her of her confidence. But there was still a spark burning inside her. She knew she couldn't give in. "I won't be your victim. You want to break me, but I'm here to tell you that you can't," she screamed, her words a cry for help, but also a challenge. And in that moment, when all seemed lost, she realized that all this was just the beginning of her fight. Hatred and prejudice would not break her. She was ready to fight to the end, even if it meant standing against this entire crowd. Time seemed to stand still. The circle of hatred and contempt tightened around her like a noose, and each of the guests seemed to be breathing down her neck, glaring at her with hateful eyes. They were ready to push her to the end, to break her willpower, and everything that surrounded her suddenly became like a battlefield, where every look and every word carried a threat. But something inside her snapped. The feeling of fear gave way to a sudden surge of energy, a resistance that awoke like lightning in the heart of a hurricane. She straightened, her shoulders squared, and her gaze became hard and cold. They could scream at her, humiliate her, hate her, but break her, she would not allow that. She took a step forward, her movements full of confidence, and the screams of hatred around her seemed to subside. "I am what you can never be. I am the one who deserves this world no less than any of you." Her voice was full of anger and unwavering strength. "Your words and contempt are just pathetic attempts to hide your fear of the truth. I am the chef of this restaurant, and I earn my place with work you will never understand." Her statement came like a bolt from the blue. The guests looked at each other, and several of them recoiled as if struck. The realization of her words broke through the wall of their arrogance, and several faces distorted in surprise and confusion. They could not believe that before them stood not just a woman, but the mistress of this kitchen, the very kitchen whose dishes they praised and whose achievements they considered their own. "You're lying," the man shouted, his voice shaking with indignation, but there was uncertainty in it. "You can't be the one running this place. You're nobody." She held his gaze, her cold, determined gaze meeting his haughty expression. "Do I have to look like you to be a boss? Or are you just too scared to admit that I've succeeded? Despite your opinion of me?" Each word she spoke seemed to hit them in the face, forcing them to retreat. But then one of the guests, standing closest, could not stand it any longer. He suddenly leaned forward and grabbed her by the shoulder. His fingers dug into her arm with such force that it seemed as if he wanted to hurt her not only with words, but also physically. "You don't belong here. We will not let you ruin our evening," he hissed, and his words seemed to go through her like a cold shiver. But instead of submitting, she only tensed up. Her voice was steady and confident as she said, "Your words cannot stop me. Your anger is nothing compared to what I have gone through to come here, and I will not give in to you." Some of the guests tried to intervene, saying that perhaps she really was the boss and not some stranger. They looked at each other warily, their faces expressing a mixture of confusion and fear. The anger in most of their eyes began to fade, and the hatred burned like fuel in the light of her steadfastness. But the man who had her shoulder in his grip wasn't going to let her go that easily. He raised his hand as if to strike, but she didn't back down. "Do you want to use violence?" she said, her voice firm despite the threat. "Are you so afraid of me that you're willing to cross the line just to maintain your power?" The words struck him like a blow. He stepped back, his face contorted with fear and confusion, and this confusion was the last straw. The other guests, watching this scene, realized that the humiliation they had intended to subject her to had backfired on them. Her steadfastness showed that nothing they said or did could break her. She looked around the room again, where the looks that had once been full of hatred were now less certain. She could see something new in their eyes, a mixture of respect and fear. They were beginning to understand that their stereotypes and prejudices, which they had thought were as solid as stone, were being shattered by her strength and resilience. Without another word, she turned and walked confidently towards the exit. She knew that this evening would remain in their memories for a long time, and now none of them would forget that she, despite all prejudices, remained a true chef. She walked down the hall, her footsteps ringing loudly in the silent restaurant like a heartbeat, while the guests, pale and confused, watched her with a hatred that grew in the silence. One of the most arrogant guests, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, could not stand her determined air and threw an icy remark after her. "So you've decided to make yourself out to be a hero?" His voice rang out like a metal whip. "Your insolence and pathetic pride only prove that people like you shouldn't be around us." He chuckled, but his eyes were full of malice. He glared at her as if she were something dirty. Her stop at the man's table was abrupt, and their eyes met like blades in combat. Her gaze betrayed nothing but a deep, quiet strength that left no room for doubt in her worth. "I am here because I am the face of this establishment. You cannot change that, no matter how much you want to." Her words were like a slap in the face for him. He couldn't stand it any longer. He stood up abruptly, slamming his fist on the table. His nostrils flared with anger, and his eyes reflected real contempt. He almost shouted, not mincing words, "There is no place for the likes of you here. This hall was created for the chosen ones, for the worthy, and not for people of your kind. How dare you stand here and call yourself a boss? You are nothing but a disgrace to this place." Those around him supported him, nodding quietly or giving him disdainful glances. They shared his hatred, and it encouraged him, gave him confidence. Some laughed at her, some whispered racial slurs. They nudged each other like predators who smelled blood. She knew they were waiting for her answer, but not to hear it. They were waiting for her to slip, for her to lose control. They needed to see her broken, to assert their dominance. She realized they were gathered around her, each one ready to use their hatred like a weapon to hurt her, to wound her, and she felt the wave of their hostility building, ready to crash down on her. Her body was tense, and it seemed that every word and gesture of these people made her even stronger. She knew that their disdain was just a mask, hiding their fear of her resilience. Taking a deep breath, she said, "Your words and your hatred will not make you stronger. I have earned a place here, just as you have earned the place where you stand now. But the difference is that I am here because of my work, not because of hereditary arrogance or prejudice." At that moment, one of them came closer to her. It was the same waiter who had refused to serve her earlier, hoping to hide his mistake under a cloak of false zeal and support for the guests. He stepped toward her, his face distorted with disdain. He sneered at her and said, "You can say what you like, but to all of us, you will always remain just another mistake of nature. The likes of you have never been our equal. Your work here is just a pathetic attempt to rise to a level you do not deserve." "How can you talk about deservedness when your right to this place is based solely on your prejudices?" she replied, not looking away. "You have no idea what it means to be strong. You only hide behind the wall of your superiority, like cowardly animals afraid of those who are not like you." Her words shocked him, and he couldn't take it anymore. His hand flew up in the air, as if he was going to strike, and his eyes expressed his readiness to cross the line, but she didn't move. Her steadfastness was so unwavering that his hand froze in midair. His face twisted in impotent rage, and he couldn't take it anymore, pushing her with his shoulder, trying to knock her off her feet. She stood her ground, not even taking a step back, and this caused even more hatred in his eyes. The whole room fell silent, as if waiting for what would happen next. They seemed to want to see her break, to succumb to their mockery. But she did not break. She stood up straight and said in a loud voice for all to hear, "Your hatred will not make you stronger. My resilience is something you can never take away from me, and your hatred is only proof that you are incapable of recognizing the truth." She stood among the crowd of enemies, her voice and her steadfastness reflecting a strength none of them possessed. It seemed that her presence, her composure, only intensified their anger, raised it to the boiling point. Some of the guests began to exchange glances, unsure how to respond. Their arrogance crumbled under the weight of her words, and with each calm, polished response, they lost control of the situation they had created. But they couldn't let her go that easily. They felt like they were losing, and it was driving them crazy. The waiter, who had so ineptly become the instigator of the humiliation, shot her a look of pure, painful hatred. He realized that it was he who had brought her here, that it was his actions that had provoked her response and, in his opinion, the disgrace to the establishment. He gritted his teeth, holding back his rage. To back down now would be to lose in front of this entire audience. Taking a step toward her, the waiter raised his hands in a defensive, falsely peaceful gesture. "Look, you need to get out of here before we have to call security," he said, a venomous pretense in his voice. "We're not here to listen to your pathetic excuses or question the status of this establishment. If you don't know your place, we'll show you." She held his gaze, her face impassive. "You will? I doubt the likes of you are capable of pointing out anything to anyone other than your own inadequacy. This place has long since ceased to be a proper institution if you were prepared to cast me out, the one who made it famous, simply because I am different from you." With that, she took a step back and headed toward the kitchen. She knew that her place was here, in this restaurant heart that her own hands had created. Thanks to her labor and skill, she was no longer going to submit to anyone's rules or give up what was rightfully hers. The guests, furious at her words, followed her, their contemptuous cries and accusations sounding like a hurricane. They were not going to let her go so easily. Once in the kitchen, she stopped in front of her employees, who could not help but notice the aggression of the crowd. She had known some of them for many years, and they understood what was happening. Among them were people who respected her for her hard work and talent, who saw her as a true professional. But even in this circle, there were those who shared the prejudices of the guests and did not take her seriously as a leader. The situation was heating up, and everyone was tensely awaiting her next move. She stood before the crowd, her voice loud and firm, making everyone stand for a moment. "You don't understand what it's like to build something with your own hands, because you've never worked for it. You only know how to judge others. You don't understand that I have a dignity that money and privilege can't buy." The crowd froze, her words cutting through the space, and those who stood near her in the kitchen, who knew her as a leader, listened to her words with surprise and respect. The waiter, unable to bear the shame, stepped forward, his face burning with humiliation. "So you really think you can just stand here and order us around? You think your words mean anything to us?" He laughed, but it was a hollow laugh, as if he were trying to convince himself that he was still in control. "My words mean everything here, because I am the one who raised this place from scratch, while you—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes flashing with anger. "You, who do not know the taste of labor, pain, and sacrifice, you only consume, creating nothing." In response to her words, one of the guests, agitated to the limit, rushed forward, grabbing her by the shoulder. "You are still here only because we allowed you to be here. You do not deserve this place." Her shoulder tensed, but she didn't flinch under his grip. She stepped back, free, and there was a hardness in her eyes that they hadn't expected. "You think you have a right to this place, but you don't. This restaurant is a reflection of my work, and no one standing here can take that away from me." The crowd began to murmur again, but her words were beginning to have an impact. Some of the guests who had been so furiously against her realized that their words, their contempt for her, had been nothing more than an attempt to vent their fears and insecurities. The waiter who had once initiated this cruel scene slowly realized that his attempts to humiliate her had backfired. She stood in the kitchen, a place that was much more than just a workspace for her. Here, every knife, every shelf, every dish held her story, her talent and strength. It seemed like the walls were breathing her, and everyone who stood in this room knew everything here was made by her hands, by every breath of her labor and love for the culinary art. But her safe haven was now the scene of a new wave of hostility. The cooks and kitchen helpers held their breath, watching as the restaurant's guests reluctantly filed into the kitchen, their faces flushed with indignation. The kitchen staff and servers, who had previously glanced at her as if she were just another detail in their daily lives, now glanced at each other. Some saw what was happening and were unsure. To them, she was the boss, someone they respected, but now they saw how intense the anger of those around them could be. Some of them might even have shared the same prejudices that were now fueling the guests' rage. Among those who had served her for all these years, one of the most experienced cooks, Jean, was always silent but attentive. She knew he was a master of his craft, whose loyalty had been tested by time, but in his eyes, too, in the face of all that had happened, she noticed confusion. He stepped closer, as if trying to shield her from the indignant crowd, but there was alarm in his gaze. "You must go, madam," They don't care who you are, they won't accept you, and if you don't give in, they will press even harder," he said quietly, trying to avoid harsh words that could make the situation worse. There was an almost paternal concern in his voice, and it made her heart clench painfully. She knew that many of her employees were just doers, used to not asking unnecessary questions, just following orders, and at some point, she realized that perhaps she was something distant, unattainable for them. Meanwhile, one of the guests, a tall man with an arrogant expression, loudly announced, "All these years I have been a regular customer of this restaurant, and now it turns out that she has been serving us. Personally, I will not put up with someone like her cooking for me. This is an insult to all of us." He glanced around the kitchen, as if seeking support, and some of the guests nodded in agreement. There was genuine indignation in their eyes, as if she had broken some secret rule. Meanwhile, the man continued, his voice growing louder, drawing more attention. "Madam Chef? What right did she have to be Madam? She..." His words broke off and he clenched his fists, eloquent sparks of indignation and contempt playing in his eyes. But she didn't let him finish. Her voice, as if calling on everything she had put into this place, was loud and without a hint of submission. "You speak of entitlement? My entitlement here is years of work and toil. This restaurant is not just a showcase for guests, it is my art, and if you need proof, look at any dish I have served here. Each of you came here for pleasure, for quality, but now that you see me, everything you received here seems unworthy to you? That is your hypocrisy, not my problem." The guests, unaccustomed to such treatment, recoiled from her words, taken aback by her confidence and strength. Their confusion momentarily weakened their hostility, but out of nowhere, one of the young chefs, a trainee with whom she rarely crossed paths, suddenly decided to speak up. "Chef, maybe you should leave. This has gone too far." His words were muffled, like condemnation, and fear flickered in his eyes. She knew it was fear of the crowd, of the hatred that had gathered around her. Those words hit her deeper than any threat from the guests. She always thought that her team was the ones who would support her at any moment. But now, when her own in turn, albeit inexperienced, but still her ward, advised her to give up, it made her feel like she was alone against everyone. But she did not allow herself to show weakness. "Leave? Do you want me to just leave? To give in to people whose words are worth nothing, to those who judge only by the color of their skin, not noticing talent? Work? No. I am here, and I will stay, because this place is mine." Gene, hearing her words, stepped forward, his teeth clenched, his face set in determination. "We've worked together for many years. Chief, I know you better than any of these people. We've seen you build this place, make it what it is. You're worthy of it, and nothing they say will change what we know." These words from the man she respected most lit a fire in her. She glanced at the guests, who were radiating hatred in waves, and said, "You may be regulars, but I will always be his heart. Your place here is temporary, but mine is forever." Her words sounded firm and decisive, and at that moment silence fell on the kitchen. The seconds passed slowly, as if time stood still, allowing everyone present to fully feel the tension in the air. In the silence and oppressive stillness, her opponents felt the humiliation growing stronger. They had come here confident in their superiority, in the right to decide who was worthy of their respect and who was not. But her words, her steadfastness, had turned against them, highlighting their fear and helplessness. There was no longer the calm arrogance in their eyes, only the anger and pain of a wounded ego. The waiter, the same one who had refused to serve her in the first place, seemed to be barely containing his rage. For him, her presence and her words were a blow to his pride. He clenched his teeth, his gaze grew cold, and, ignoring her authority, he walked towards her, menacingly closing the distance. His face was distorted by an expression in which contempt and rage were mixed. Suddenly he stopped right in front of her, so close that she could hear his ragged breathing. He whispered, barely containing himself, "You think you've won? That we're just going to back down and let you stand here, humiliating us in front of our guests?" His voice was quiet, but filled with hatred. "You're nothing. All these years you've worked here, you've been invisible to us, just labor, and now you dare think you deserve respect? This is ridiculous, and I'm going to make you pay for it." With that, he slapped her hard on the shoulder, pushing her against the wall. The kitchen utensils clanged against each other as she struggled to stay on her feet, nearly falling from the impact, but he didn't stop, his glare blazing as he continued to advance. pushing her again and again, not allowing her to retreat. The crowd watched the scene as if it were a spectacle, no one daring to intervene or object. The third time she felt the push, she staggered, but she did not give in to its pressure. When she was a step away from the wall, she stood up straight, looking him straight in the eyes, as if he were nothing more than part of the dirt on the floor she was walking on. She met his gaze with dignity, and her cool confidence only added fuel to the fire. This infuriated him. He turned, snatched a kitchen knife from the shelf, and raised it menacingly in front of him. The crowd froze. Some of the guests stepped back sharply, shocked by what was happening. Gene, the cook she had worked with for many years, stepped forward, his eyes burning with hatred for the situation. "You have crossed all boundaries," he breathed, ready to intervene to stop this cruel prank. But the waiter was in such a state that no one and nothing could stop him. He was not going to submit to authority. He wanted to crush her, make her feel helpless. He mocked, raising the knife closer to her face. "And what? You still think that you have the right to be here? You are just dirt that I can wipe away at any moment." With these words, he made a threatening lunge towards her, but she did not flinch. Her face remained hard as granite. At that moment, Gene grabbed his hand, forcing him to let go of the knife. He knew his actions could cost him his career, but he couldn't let this go on. He saw in her face a resilience and a strength that made the likes of this waiter powerless. "You've gone too far," Gene whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "She's your boss, and you're nothing here, no matter how much you'd like to think otherwise." The crowd watched the scene in disbelief. Their privileged, elite universe was crumbling before their eyes as they confronted the truth. They could not bear her presence, her power, and it made her the object of their hatred. And even when their most cold-blooded protector, the waiter, was stopped, they were not ready to give up their fury. A few guests, people accustomed to having the last word, stepped forward. One of the men, the regular customer whose voice always sounded louder than the others, looked at her with disdain. "You two just destroyed this place. You think we're going to keep quiet?" His voice was an accusation, full of chilling contempt. "We'll make sure you can't work in any decent establishment. You don't belong here. You're just a mistake, a misunderstanding that needs to be erased." He snorted, looking around the crowd, as if asking each person to support him. She didn't look away. Her eyes were calm, her face serene. She knew their words were nothing more than an attempt to defend themselves, an attempt to hide their weakness behind a mask of hatred. She took a deep breath and said, "You can try to destroy my name. You can scream and rage, but I don't stay here for your approval. You leave, and I stay. Your words mean nothing in this room, because the power of this place is not in you or your preconceived notions. It is in the people who work here and create all of this every day." She turned, her gaze darting to Gene, who nodded, understanding that she was asking him to take command. Leaving her post behind him, she stepped out the kitchen door, feeling the looks of hatred and defeat behind her. As she walked through the room, she felt the hatred seeping into every corner of the space, every glance piercing her back. Adults whose faces she had known for years now looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if her presence defiled the walls where they were accustomed to being praised and served. Their hostility was barely concealed. One of the guests, an elderly woman known for her connections and power, sat up irritably and spoke in a loud, shrill voice, especially to make her words sound as loud as possible. "We will never allow someone like her to work here. This restaurant has always been an oasis of sophistication, but now we find out who's in charge. This is completely unacceptable." She sighed, her face contorted with disdain. Another guest, a young man with an arrogant expression, joined her in response. He gave the chef a look that was more than just contempt. It was a hard, cold sense of superiority. "This is a place for those who deserve to be here. We will not tolerate those who do not fit into our circle. You have no say in this. Your place is in the kitchen, if anywhere at all." They stood there, surrounding her from all sides, like a pack of wolves who had finally found their prey. No one was going to leave her alone. They kept pressing her. Their words were weapons. Every comment was sharpened. Every blow was painful. She stood up straight, but she saw how their attacks penetrated deeper. A growing murmur arose among the guests, mixing with her calm and cold gaze, which penetrated their stream of hatred, destroying their confidence. But suddenly, one of the restaurant's most influential customers stepped forward, Mr. Brown, a regular who had always expressed respect for her and her culinary art, until the day when the truth about her became a personal insult to him. He came close to her, almost touching her, and, without deigning to look at her, said in a way that echoed around the room, "I'll post pictures. Tell everyone what's going on here. This restaurant has no right to call itself elite if its kitchen is headed by such a person." His tone was full of undisguised contempt and deliberate humiliation, as if he was trying to erase her presence with one word. He waved his phone around as if the threat of social media posting could break her. He took a video, moving closer to capture her face, hoping to see even a hint of fear, to see her confidence crumble under his accusing gaze. He walked toward her like a man accustomed to winning, confident that his power and influence could bring him another easy victory. But she didn't give in. She didn't retreat. She didn't turn away. "Take pictures. Write them down. Do whatever you want." Her voice was calm as the ocean before a storm. "Let everyone see who you really are. I'm not going to hide my work and my power. And you're already seen as you are. Every comment you make, every gesture you make is a disgrace only for you." Her words cut like a blade, piercing their arrogance. She came closer to Mr. Brown, almost touching his shoulder, causing him to recoil as if touching something forbidden, dangerous. Mr. Brown, feeling threatened by her strength and her confidence, turned sharply to face the other guests, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you see how far she has come? She is here, in the center of the room, in our place, as if she can stand on an equal footing with us. We need to put an end to this so that we can return to normal life, to the one that is meaningful and valuable to us." The guests, indignant at Mr. Brown's words, nodded, their faces taking on cruel, contemptuous expressions. The guests around her, as if on cue, retreated back, falling back in a row, as if preparing for another attack. And then one of them loudly declared, turning to her, "We won't just leave. We'll make sure no decent person ever crosses the threshold of this establishment. This restaurant will become cursed. You'll lose everything you've worked so hard to build, and it will be your fault." Suddenly, someone from the crowd threw one of the glass goblets onto the floor, which shattered into pieces with a dull ringing sound. This was a sign. The other guests, taking up his gesture, began throwing glasses, forks, knives, creating a circle of glass shards and sharp metal edges around her. They were no longer shy about expressing their hatred. Their rage and contempt filled the space, and their every gesture was aimed at destroying her morally. But she stood still, not letting them break her. Her gaze was full of determination, and she looked at them as if they were nothing, just shadows of the past that would disappear without a trace. A realization burned in her soul. She had built this place. She had made it great, and no one had the right to take away her work. She raised her hand, pointing at them, without shaking, without losing control. "This restaurant is mine, and you are temporary guests who will be forgotten in an instant." Each blast of glass shattering that echoed through the room seemed to increase the tension that had been building in the air up until that point. The guests' gazes grew more aggressive and hateful, their impulses coming not only from anger but also from fear of what they could not control. Their sense of superiority, of being able to dominate anyone who did not live up to their standards, was suddenly under threat. Despite the chaos, the chef still stood like a fortress in the storm, her eyes radiating a strength that these arrogant men could not match. This was her kitchen, her world, and they had no right to claim it. Every guest who raised their voice, everyone who threw objects, only strengthened her resolve. She knew that in her hands lay not only her fate, but the fate of everyone who worked with her. At that moment, one of the guests, panicking, rushed forward, as if he knew that this was his moment. He grabbed one of the shards, wrapped it in a napkin, and threw it in her direction, as if in a stubborn act of desperation. The shard flew past, barely grazing her shoulder, leaving only a red mark on her skin, a small reminder of the hatred that raged around her. Instead of being scared or discouraged, she merely raised her chin higher, her voice louder, confident and clear, cutting through the noise. "You think you can scare me? You think your contempt and hatred can destroy what I have created? Look around you. Each of you is a void. Each of you is just a foolish attempt to maintain a privileged position that you have long considered your right." Every word she said hit the mark, causing some of the guests to wince as they felt the sting. But her confidence, her steadfastness, only fueled the hatred in others. her opponents began to rush from fear to rage, looking for ways to humiliate her further. One woman, who seemed to be in the center of the group, came closer, her face twisted in anger. "You're a disgrace to this place. You're a disgrace to our culture. You're something we don't need. We're civilized people, and you're just..." She stared at her with disgust. Scum that should have stayed in the kitchen. It was like a knife to the heart, her words cutting deep, but instead of being discouraged, she embraced her pain, turning it into strength. She knew that to these people, she was more than just a boss. She was just a reminder that their power was an illusion, and she refused to give in. She stepped towards the woman, getting close enough to see the passion in her eyes, and said, "That is your definition of civilized, not mine. I will not lose myself. I will not sink to your level. I came here to serve art, not your preconceived notions. I am not your property, and I never will be." In response to her words, the group of guests began to scream furiously, their anger reaching a new level. They began to throw everything they could get their hands on at her: wine, bread, even cutlery. Each object was filled with malice. Each throw seemed like a final stab, designed to break her. But she only looked at them with disdain, not showing how the pain and humiliation was trying to take hold of her. Every gesture they made was a show of weakness. She knew that their actions were not just anger, but fear that their world could collapse if they did not defend their position. The huge glass chandelier above them began to sway with the movement. And then, at one point, one of the guests, losing control, pushed another, and he, hitting the table, hit the chandelier with a loud crack, right on her head. Shards of glass rained down like a swarm of sharp arrows, trying to hit her. Luckily, at that moment, Jean, seeing the threat, grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. Shards of broken glass scattered around the room, and screams filled the space. She couldn't hold back a scream when some of the shards still scratched her shoulder. Her hand immediately became caked, and she felt blood begin to flow down her arm. Mixed with her anger, she began to notice the bitterness and pain turning into determination. She began to move faster, and all her movements were full of confidence, as if everything they did only brought her closer to victory. "You will not win," she said, her voice now like thunder. "You cannot break the light you seek to stifle. I was here before you, and I will be here after." Every word she said hit like a hammer, and the shards of glass that flew past her seemed harmless compared to the attacks she suffered daily from these people. Amidst the chaos and panic, she noticed the other team members starting to emerge from the kitchen. Their faces reflected the same determination as hers. They had come to support their boss, and that was what she had always known. The force they had created together was far more powerful than any single word of hate. She turned to her team, her voice loud and clear again. "We are one. We are our kitchen. We are the ones who create this atmosphere, and no one can take that away from us. I am your chef, and I will never let you stoop so low." The group of guests froze, their faces twisted in grimaces of hatred, but no longer certain. They began to realize that their efforts were merely knocking on glass walls that would never collapse, and their attempts to humiliate her would ultimately only result in their own downfall. Mr. Brown, among them, saw his power, his ability to manipulate anything he wanted, fading. He was a shadow in the bright light, and sensing that things were not going as he had planned, he turned sharply and shouted, "Get out! We don't need your presence. Let's go!" It was like a silent betrayal. The screams, anger and hatred gave way to surprise. The guests began to shift, like a herd over which a shadow had fallen, and soon, with panic on their faces, they began to leave the hall. Silence fell over the space and she was left standing in the middle of the ruined hall, her clothes soaked in blood, broken glass and insults, but she felt she had won. With each passing second, a sense of strength and determination filled her soul, and she knew that this time her voice had been heard. The cooks around her, her fellow kitchen staff, came closer, their faces filled with genuine admiration, and they surrounded her, creating a protective circle in which she could recuperate. She smiled, knowing that together they could weather any storm that might arise in the future. The lights in the restaurant were now dimming, and the silence that followed the storm seemed too loud. It was filled with tension, as if every breath was dictated by fear and mistrust. The guests who had just been voicing their disdainful opinions were now slowly filing out, leaving behind them an empty space where hatred once reigned. The chef stood in the center, her hands still shaking with adrenaline, blood slowly trickling down her shoulder. She could feel her heart pounding, but looking at her team, she saw the support they gave her. Their faces reflected the same determination she felt. A quiet unity formed around them, despite the earlier fears and panicked cries. But suddenly, voices were heard from the street. She felt her stomach clench as she saw several more people, known regulars by the looks of it, start to approach the door. This time, they were full of anger and a desire for revenge. Their faces were twisted in hatred, as if they were furious that their failure in the previous round had not been able to break her. She knew that this confrontation was just beginning. "Do you really think you can just walk away from this?" one of them shouted, a tall man with a distinctive hairdo. "Do you think we're going to let you stay here after you've humiliated us like this?" He was ready to fight, and there was a fire in his eyes that promised only one thing: cruelty. At that moment, her confidence wavered a little. She didn't know how many people were waiting for them outside, how many forces were ready to wipe her and her team off the face of the earth. "We're not leaving," she said forcefully, knowing she had to support her colleagues. "This restaurant is ours, and we won't let you ruin everything we've built." As they bickered, other contestants came onto the stage, people who had seen the chef struggle and who had been on the sidelines all along, ready to join in the same fight. They stood united in a common purpose, but it was not enough to calm the fear that clutched at her chest. "You're nothing," one of the women who remained in the room shot back. "You're not just black. You're a black woman who should never have risen to this level. There's no place for you in this world." Her words were like knives, piercing her soul, but she wasn't going to let her emotions get the better of her. She had been through too much already, and she knew that giving up now would be the biggest mistake. "Remove us?" Her voice became sharp and loud. "Remove me and my team? How dare you say that? We are here, and we are staying." Meanwhile, the crowd outside the doors grew, their anger turning into physical aggression. As if on cue, they began to push at the doors, demanding to enter. Finally, one of the doors gave way, and they poured into the hall like a wave of hatred. The chef stood in the foreground, her team surrounded. In that moment, her thoughts returned to the nights spent in the kitchen, how they labored over each dish, trying to create something amazing that could bring people together. This was more than just food. It was a way to convey history, tradition, and love. But now the faces before her were full of hatred and contempt. Her heart sank with anger and helplessness. "You think you can come here and destroy what we've built?" she roared like thunder. "You're nothing without us. We're what makes this restaurant what it is. We're the art you can't stifle." But her words were of no use against the oncoming storm. The guests, united, began to press her and her team. One of them grabbed a chair and threw it in her direction. The chair smashed against the wall, and pieces flew around. "Look how she rebels. Look how she tries to raise her head. She is not worthy of respect," one of the guests shouted. Looking around the crowd, "Let's make her understand what real strength is." Suddenly the crowd, obviously against her, rushed towards her. Their hands reached out to grab her by the shoulders, by the hair. She felt someone grab her hair, holding her as if they wanted to destroy her. Fear shot through her, but in that moment she remembered her colleagues, all those who believed in her. Unable to bear the humiliation any longer, she broke free and lunged for her only weapon, the kitchen knife that always lay on the nearby counter. She grabbed it like a knight ready for battle, but there was no cruelty in her eyes, only a determination to protect what she had built and those who stood with her. "I'm not going to give up," she said, her voice filled with steely determination. "I'll protect this place, even if I have to fight for it, even if I have to fight you." In response to her courage, the crowd froze. They felt a taut string of tension about to snap. This was not just a physical battle. It was a fight for respect, for dignity. The screams and curses filled the air again, and in that moment the chef realized that her fighting spirit was not an act of aggression, but rather a symbol of her strength. She was not prepared to let these people tear her dreams apart. Grabbing the knife, she raised it high again. Her team's eyes met hers, and in their eyes she saw support, confidence, and a willingness to stand by her side as one. "We are not alone," she said, her voice full of passion and strength. "We are together, and we will stand in this place, no matter what." Suddenly, her team became one, stepping forward to protect their chef. They formed a line, ready to defend themselves, and in that moment, the chef realized that she was not only fighting for herself, but for all those who, like her, were striving to rise above hatred. Now the fight was not in the kitchen, but here, in the heart of the restaurant, where hatred and prejudice tried to trample their dreams. Grabbing a knife, she took responsibility for each of them. "If you need victims so much, you will get them, but not from us," she said with a defiant smile that eclipsed all her pain. At that moment, the room filled with courage, and her confidence became the spark that ignited a fire in her team. Now they stood together, ready to fight for their place, for their kitchen, for everything they had built. The crowd outside seemed to be consumed by rage and hatred, growing increasingly heated, like a forest on fire. Eyes full of aggression looked at the chef and her team, and there was not a drop of humanity in them. In this moment, all their attempts to humiliate her, all their words about prejudice and racism seemed to turn against them, and this hatred was now poured onto her shoulders. The chef, holding the knife with a confident grip, felt the adrenaline rushing through her veins, filling her with determination. Every angry cry, every threat became only fuel for her inner fire. She knew that now she was standing not only for herself, but for everyone who was here, for everyone who had ever been discriminated against and hated. "I will not be a victim of your anger," she said loudly, listening to the other. "Do you think that your hatred will make me weak? It only strengthens me." The team behind her began to buzz, each of them pulling themselves up and taking their fighting stance. They were ready to defend their rights, their place, and their profession. This kitchen, this team, this was their heritage, their pride. But the tension in the air grew more ominous. The people pressing in from the outside began to push in, and their frantic cries grew louder. The chef felt fear creeping up on her team, but she was not about to give in. She turned to them, seeing a mixture of anxiety and determination in their eyes. "We're not just cooks," she said, her voice full of determination. "We're creators. We're artists. We don't just cook food. We create art. We won't let anyone take that away from us." At that moment, the crowd, sensing her confidence, rushed the door, and with a dull thud it swung open. The first few people poured into the restaurant like a hurricane, their faces distorted with hatred and anger. "This is your last night," one of them shouted, holding a bottle full of drinks he was about to smash. "You will remember this." She managed to notice the bottle flying towards her. At that moment, time slowed down. Her inner instinct kicked in and, to her surprise, she intercepted the flying bottle, deftly directing it back. The glass shattered against the wall, and the shards flew around, hitting those who were too close. "You want war?" she screamed, her voice becoming as wild as an enraged beast. "I will give you war, but you will not win." Cheering on her team, she rushed toward her comrades. Each of them knew that not only their jobs were at stake, but also their dignity. Fighting hatred, fighting prejudice, fighting cruelty, that was what they had to do. One of the cooks, a young man with great talent, grabbed a projectile he had found in the kitchen and threw it into the crowd. A battle broke out. One plate after another flew into the faces of the people who hated them. Shouts echoed through the room, and the atmosphere became filled with anger. The people in the room began to respond as if they were part of a grand theater. Guests who had come for the food, for the art, suddenly found themselves caught between two fires, between their hatred and the culinary pride of the chef and her team. This conflict split the place in half, and the chef realized that what they were most upset about was that she had raised her voice, defending her rights. "You don't need us," shouted one of the older guests, whom she had once considered a friend. "You are nothing. You are a disgrace to our kitchen." Her heart sank when she heard this, but instead of hanging her head, she screamed, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You can't break me." This was the moment when hatred reached its peak. The crowd, conquering fear, began to throw everything that came to hand, but the chef and her team were not going to retreat. Every swing of the knife, every blow, every movement became not only an act of defense, but also a symbol of their fight for equality and respect. Suddenly, amidst the chaos, one of the patrons who had been left behind rose to his feet. It was a man, older in age, but with determination in his eyes. He began to speak, his voice full of power, and he addressed the crowd. "This is not what we stand for. We cannot allow hatred to destroy what we have created. You think you can oppress a person just because of the color of their skin? This is unacceptable." The crowd froze, and at that moment the chef saw some of them begin to waver, as if their conscience was awakening. They did not know how to react to his words. This was the time when everything could change. This is my kitchen, and I am proud that talented and hardworking people work here, regardless of their skin color," he continued, and there was sincerity in his voice. "You must not lose sight of the fact that all of us, as a whole, make this restaurant what it is." His words began to reach the ears of even the most hardened haters, and the chef felt her power growing. She knew they were on the edge now. If she could mobilize all those who were part of this hateful environment, maybe they could turn this frustration into something greater. "We have to be together," she screamed, her voice loud as thunder. "We can't let hatred divide us. We have to come together to create something bigger, something better." But the crowd began to rise again, and people froze again, doubting whether they were ready to accept her determination. At that moment, one of the guests, who had moved away from the whole situation, raised his hand and, as if awakening the others, shouted, "Yes, let's unite." That sentence set off a wave of change. The other guests, many of whom had only been witnesses, began to realize that they were not just spectators but participants in this story. They could not sit idly by while such humiliation was happening. As if in slow motion, they began to sink into their seats, arms outstretched toward the chef. With each step and movement, the hatred began to recede. Like waves before an ebb tide, the battle between prejudice and courage had entered its final stages. "We are a team," she said, her voice echoing throughout the room, reaching everyone there, "and there is no room for hate on this team." The chef, joining forces with those who supported her, stood like a bright beacon in the darkness. At that moment, the hatred, aggression and prejudice began to dissipate like smoke leaving a burnt house. It was a new day for everyone. She knew that they were all together now, and despite all the trials they had endured, they were ready to fight for their place and their art. And this restaurant, which had once been an arena of hatred, was now a symbol of hope, change and respect. The tension in the restaurant seemed to have reached its breaking point. The events of the last few minutes had left deep wounds, and there was still a sense of menace in the air. The chef, standing in the center of the room with a knife in her hand, looked at the people who had just been ready to stab her. Their faces gradually changed, first angry, then confused, and then uncertain. But that was not all. Behind those who tried to stop the hatred, a loud cry was heard. A crowd they did not see stood outside, even more people, ready for conflict, like animals thirsting for blood. The hatred and anger they carried with them became even more dangerous. "Don't let them destroy us," one of the cooks shouted, his words echoing throughout the room. "This isn't just a fight for the restaurant. This is a fight for our lives." The crowd, unaware of the consequences of their actions, rushed towards the door again. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the chef realized that the situation could get out of control. She was not going to wait for the hatred to flare up again. "Become a wall," she shouted to her team, and they instantly understood her intention. In unison, they formed a chain of people, each one ready to defend their place, their family. It wasn't just a defense now, it was an unwavering resolve not to let them break them. The crowd, seeing that their victims were ready to fight, became even more aggressive. They began throwing everything they could: chairs, tables, bottles. It wasn't just an attack, it was a display of rage, as if they were trying to crush everything that was good in the place. "Get them out," one of them shouted, and the team began to respond. The clashes became inevitable. Like a whirlpool, they grappled with each other, and the streams of hatred were ready to engulf everything. The chef, feeling her team begin to retreat under the pressure, cried out, "Don't give up. Each of you stands for your dream. Each of you has the right to be here." She knew her words were meant to be their shield, and that shield mattered. She charged into the thick of it, using her skills to push through the enemy lines, pushing them away from her cooks. In that moment, she felt her heart pounding, adrenaline filling her mind. Every step she took was like a flash. She felt her soul being torn apart by fear, but she could not give in. Her knife, which in her hands was not just a tool, became a symbol of her struggle. She knew that this battle was not just for a restaurant, but for her life, for the lives of those who supported her. Screams, groans, noise, everything mixed in one common anger, and at some point the chef lost control of the situation. She saw one of her employees, a young man with a kind heart, thrown to the floor, and her heart stabbed with horror. He was the only one who came to her aid when she was in trouble. "No!" she screamed, and without thinking about anything, she rushed towards him. But the crowd, which was literally ready to swallow her, flooded her, making her feel small and defenseless. Her dream of peace and respect was being met with harsh reality. She saw hatred consume them. She saw people she once considered friends become cruel enemies. She understood that hatred was not only outside, but also inside. "You have no right to do this," she screamed, but her words were drowned out by cries of rage. At that moment, she decided that she had to do something more radical. She raised her knife to the sky, and her voice grew louder. "This is not just my fight. This is our fight. We must unite against hatred." This cry seemed to create a furor. The guests rose to their feet, and as if awakening from their frenzy, began to understand that all this time they had been part of this hatred. Each of them, sitting in silence, also had his share of responsibility. "I won't let you humiliate us," one of the guests shouted, and that was the beginning of change. "We are all people, and we have the right to be respected." One man's words became a spark. Another man stood up, then another. People began to rise to their feet, despite all the hatred that surrounded them. It was the moment when hatred met humanity, and it seemed as if the dark cloud of hatred began to dissipate. The chef felt her team's strength begin to grow again. Each of them realized that they were not alone. Each of them was part of this fight, part of this power. The hatred that had once been invincible was now beginning to recede. But as they began to line up, another blow came from the crowd. One of the aggressors, having lost control, decided that it was his place to attack and rushed towards the chef screaming. At that moment, when everything around froze, the chef managed to dodge at the last moment, but she could not avoid the blow. Her body was pushed away from the wall and she felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. She realized that she could fall, could lose everything she had built, but at the same time, a fire ignited in her heart. "I will not give up," she said, and her voice echoed throughout the hall. It was not just a scream, it was an expression of her inner strength, her resilience, her spirit. She could not fall until she had finished this hatred. Around her, her team, her friends, began to gather as backup. They were ready to stand up for not only the chef, but each other. This act of solidarity was the beginning of a new era for them all. While the real battle was unfolding in the restaurant, hatred, although strong, no longer had a chance. Everyone who was there understood, this was not just a fight for a place. It was a fight for humanity, for equality, for all those ideals that they considered important. The crowd, which had started out hating, gradually became disunited, and the chef knew that they were capable of more than just fighting. They were capable of creating something new, something better. And in that moment, when the last scream of hatred died down, the chef realized that perhaps this night was just the beginning of their journey to true respect and understanding. They were in a position to change the world, a small but significant step. And this kitchen where hatred began was now a place where the flames of rebirth burned, where strong-willed people came together to fight for a future where hatred would no longer have power over them. This was their time. That night, as the last screams of hatred died down, the restaurant, once filled with prejudice and fear, began to take on new life. The chef, standing among her team, felt a new spirit of unity around them. They were all together, each of them fighting for their rights and their dreams, and no one could take that feeling away from them. The team began clearing the place of the aftermath of what had happened, the battle, the seams of hatred that still remained. But now, as they cleared away the shattered glass and torn tablecloths, they weren't just rebuilding a physical space, they were building something bigger, a new beginning. The chef looked at her staff, and in their eyes she saw not just fear or anxiety, but determination and hope. They understood that this night was not just an outbreak of hatred, but an opportunity for change. They had the power to create a culture of respect and support, where everyone felt safe, where their differences became the foundation of their strength. Gathered in a circle, the team raised their hands and each of them spoke their dreams and hopes for the future. It became their vow to never let hate take over their hearts again. They knew that the real fight for equality and respect was just beginning, but they were ready to fight for it. The chef knew their journey would be difficult. They would face prejudice, rejection, and ignorance. But now they had something more powerful than hatred. It was their unity, their love, and their desire to make the world a better place. When they finally finished cleaning, the chef walked up to her colleagues and said, "We are not just cooks. We are a community. We are a family, and in our family there is no room for hatred." With that, They began to prepare dinner, but it wasn't just any dinner, it was a symbol of a new beginning. Each ingredient was a reminder that they were all different, but that diversity was their strength. And when the first guests started to enter the restaurant, they felt that the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a place where hatred reigned, but a space where everyone was accepted, respected and appreciated. Guests felt free and comfortable, and this was only the beginning. The chef, standing behind her kitchen, understood that the real battle was not just about standing up for her rights, but about creating a place where everyone could feel equal. She was ready to continue this fight, and her team was with her. As the dinner ended and the guests left the restaurant, the chef felt a new fire burning inside her, a fire of hope. She knew they could change the world, and they had taken the first step in that direction, and this was their time, a time for change. That evening, when the restaurant was empty, the chef went outside and looked at the stars. Knowing that this was only the beginning of their journey, she felt that despite all the trials, there was a bright future ahead. So, in the end, the hate couldn't win. They learned to fight not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever suffered from prejudice. And that kitchen, that restaurant, became a symbol of change, a place where people found strength, where they learned to respect each other, and where dreams became reality. With this realization, the chef re-entered the restaurant, ready for new challenges and new victories, knowing that together they could change this world for the better.